Late May 1944, the air above Normandy was heavy with salt and mist, the English Channel stretching grey and endless beyond the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. Inside a coastal bunker, Oberleutnant Fredo Ebling watched the horizon through binoculars, his breath fogging against the glass. Below him, the sea broke violently against the limestone wall that fell 100 feet to the narrow beach. Around him, his men moved with quiet confidence. They had built this fortress into the bones of the earth, a labyrinth of trenches, casemates and concrete strongpoints, bristling with machine guns and 155mm artillery. To them, this place was untouchable. From that height it seemed absurd that any enemy could rise from the water and live long enough to fight. The Germans believed the math was absolute. 100 feet of sheer cliff, intersecting fields of fire, minefields behind, and the finest soldiers of the Atlantic Wall holding every inch. Their commanders called it impregnable, a fortress that could watch over both Utah and Omaha beaches, its 6 howitzers able to tear apart any landing craft before it touched sand. Yet across the channel, another kind of calculation was being made, one that ignored the odds and trusted in will. Within the planning rooms of the Allied headquarters in London, the maps of Normandy were spread beneath a haze of cigarette smoke. General Eisenhower's staff had marked Pointe du Hoc with a red circle, not because it was the easiest target, but because it was the most dangerous. If those guns survived D-Day, both American beaches could be turned into slaughter fields. Destroying them became a necessity. Conventional assaults were ruled out. The cliffs were too high, too well protected, and the terrain inland too dense for paratroopers to reach from the rear. Air and naval bombardments might damage the emplacements, but could not guarantee destruction. Only one path remained, a direct climb from the sea under enemy fire. The assignment fell to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a calm, steel-eyed Texan whose quiet resolve masked the weight of what he was being asked to do. When General Omar Bradley handed him the mission, he admitted plainly, this could be the most dangerous task of the entire invasion. Rudder studied the photographs, the cliffs, the bunkers, the interlocking defences, and after a long silence simply said, "My men can do it." From that moment, the impossible had a name. Through April and May, Rudder's Rangers trained on the southern coast of England, scaling cliffs near Swanage in rain and wind, practicing until their fingers bled. British commandos taught them every method of vertical assault: ropes, ladders, grappling hooks, even rocket-launched lines that could carry ropes over cliff edges. Each man learned to climb with full gear, carrying 70 pounds of weapons and ammunition, because there would be no resupply once they began. They practiced until the motions became reflex. Shoot, throw, climb, pull, fire again. The sound of the waves and the slap of rope against stone became their constant rhythm. Rudder told them what few commanders would. Some would die before reaching the top, others would never make it that far. But if any soldiers on Earth could take Pointe du Hoc, it was them. By early June, everything was ready. The assault force, companies D, E and F, would lead the climb, 225 men in total. The 5th Ranger Battalion would follow if success was signalled, or divert to Omaha Beach if not. The fleet was waiting. Battleships, destroyers, and landing craft. On June 6th, before dawn, the men boarded their boats in darkness, seas heaving and wind cutting like knives. They were drenched before they left sight of the transport ship. Around them stretched the greatest armada in human history. Thousands of vessels converging on the French coast. At 5:50 a.m., the battleship USS Texas opened fire, its 14-inch guns lighting the horizon, followed by the destroyers Satterlee and Talibont. The roar was continuous, the sky alive with flame and thunder. From a distance, it looked as though nothing could survive on the cliffs. Yet within that storm of fire, a single navigational error began to twist the plan. The British motor launch leading the Rangers flotilla had veered too far east, toward Pointe de la Percée, 3 miles from the true objective. The mistake cost precious minutes. When the correction came, they were already behind schedule, the light growing stronger, the tide shifting. Rudder's men would hit the beach 40 minutes late, in full daylight, with the element of surprise gone. They could already hear the Germans returning to their posts above the shattered cliffs. As the Rangers' boats turned toward the real target, the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc came into view, scarred by bombardment, veiled in smoke, but still standing. No one could tell whether the guns were destroyed or waiting. Rudder's voice came over the radio, steady, calm, prepare to land. The words carried across the boats like a spark. Each man knew what came next. No retreat, no second attempt, only the climb. The first landing craft hit the shallows at 7:10 a.m. Rudder was first off, wading through knee-deep water as machine gun fire erupted from above. Bullets struck the surf in silver sprays. Men fell before they reached the rocks. Those who made it pressed themselves against the base of the cliff, gasping, their world reduced to stone and sound. Above them, ropes fired upward, rockets trailing smoke, their grappling hooks vanishing into the mist. Some fell short, others caught. The Rangers began to climb. The ropes quivered under the weight of men and gear, swaying with every impact of German bullets. The air filled with the crack of MG-42s, the rattle of falling rock, and the scream of grenades tumbling from above. Limestone splinters rained down like shrapnel. The sea turned black with smoke, but still, they climbed. Some used knives to dig into the cracks, some clawed with bare fingers when ropes were cut. The destroyers offshore moved dangerously close, their 5-inch guns firing so near that fragments of shell and seawater sprayed the climbers. The Rangers reached halfway, then 3/4, then the final stretch where every muscle burned and every heartbeat echoed louder than the gunfire. At 7:25 a.m, Sergeant Hayward Robbie of E Company threw himself over the edge and came face to face with 3 Germans preparing to drop grenades. His Thompson barked 3 times, 3 bodies fell. The cliff was taken, barely. Within minutes, 30 Rangers stood on the plateau firing, shouting, spreading out through the smoke and shattered earth. They had done what was said to be impossible, and then came the shock. The concrete gun emplacements were empty. Inside the casemates, where 6 155mm artillery pieces should have stood, there were only wooden poles. Painted, carved, decoys meant to fool Allied reconnaissance. The guns they had risked everything to destroy were gone. For a moment, disbelief paralyzed them. Some cursed, others laughed hysterically. Rudder himself climbed over the edge moments later and saw the same sight. The entire point, the fortress, the cliffs, the blood they'd spilled, had been guarding nothing. But then instinct took over. If the guns weren't here, they had to be close. Find them, Rudder ordered, his voice hoarse but certain. They didn't move them far. Destroy them wherever they are. The Rangers fanned out in small patrols, pushing inland through craters and trenches. Every step could be mined. Every hedgerow could hide an ambush. The Germans were regrouping fast, firing from the observation bunker and from trenches to the east. Machine guns swept the open ground. The Rangers fought through it all, rifles cracking, grenades exploding in the earth, smoke rising like ghosts over the cliffs. By 8:15, 24 men had reached the coastal road south of the point and dug in along the embankment. Among them was First Sergeant Leonard Lamel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, both from D Company. Lamel was bleeding from a shrapnel wound but refused to stop. When he spotted deep tyre tracks leading inland through a farm path, he knew instantly what they meant. The missing guns had been moved. Without waiting for orders, he and Kuhn advanced down the narrow lane, weapons ready, hearts hammering. The hedgerows on either side rose like walls, dense and silent. They moved in leaps, one covering, the other advancing. Then Lamel froze. Through a break in the leaves, he saw them. 5 massive 155mm guns hidden beneath camouflage netting, their barrels aimed toward Utah Beach, stacks of shells beside them, fuses already set. No sentries stood nearby. Only a group of Germans gathered 100 meters away, talking, unaware that 2 Americans were within grenade range of their entire battery. Lamel turned to Kuhn. "We found them," he whispered. "We found the damn guns." He carried 1 thermite grenade. Kuhn had another. It wasn't enough. But waiting meant risking thousands of men on the beaches below. Lamel took a deep breath, crawled forward through mud and nettles and reached the nearest gun. He pulled the pin and placed the grenade into the recoil cylinder. White-hot metal hissed and flowed, melting steel, welding the mechanism shut. He moved to the next gun using Kuhn's grenade. Then, with no more explosives, he used the butt of his Thompson to smash the sights on every weapon, cracking the optics, shattering the calibration. The whole act took less than 10 minutes. The battery that could have destroyed the American landings had been silenced by 2 Rangers with 2 grenades. Lamel and Kuhn withdrew and sprinted back to their roadblock, gathering more thermite grenades from wounded comrades. Within an hour, they returned to finish the job. All 6 guns were reduced to twisted steel. At 9:05 a.m., a runner delivered the message to Rudder. Located guns. All destroyed. Mission accomplished. The relief was brief. The Germans were already counterattacking. Mortar shells began to fall across the cliff top. The observation bunker at the tip of the point came alive again, machine guns sweeping the ground. Rudder's men dug in, linking their positions, conserving ammunition. They had completed their mission, but now they were stranded, isolated, low on supplies, surrounded by an enemy, determined to wipe them out. As the day wore on, German infantry advanced from the south and west, probing, firing, testing the Rangers' perimeter. Mortars rained down without pause. Snipers in the hedgerows picked off any movement. The wounded lay in shell craters, tended by medics with dwindling morphine. The Rangers repelled every attack with rifles, BARs and grenades until the sun began to sink and the sea turned red beneath the cliffs. That night, as darkness fell on June 6th, Rudder's small force held less than half the ground they had captured. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food and water were scarce. The radio operator reported that contact with the main invasion forces was uncertain. The Rangers had no idea if the beaches below had succeeded or failed. They only knew they were alone. When flares lit the night sky, German infantry came again, first in small groups, then in waves. The Rangers fired until their barrels smoked, then used captured weapons. The sound of gunfire echoed off the cliffs for hours. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder moved from position to position, encouraging his men bleeding from 2 wounds of his own. "Hold your ground," he said quietly. "We'll be relieved." Just hold no one slept. By midnight, another attack struck from the south. Machine guns raked the roadblock. Grenades exploded among the foxholes. Lamel found himself down to his last magazine, then his last 3 rounds, then nothing. He fought with what he could find. When the attack broke less than 10 meters from their line, the Rangers counterattacked with bayonets and rifle butts, driving the Germans back into the dark. When dawn came on June 7th, the smoke lifted to reveal a landscape of ruin. Craters, corpses, shattered weapons. The Rangers were still there, still alive, but down to their final ammunition. German reinforcements were closing in. The men counted grenades by the handful, bullets by the pocket. They had been fighting for 24 hours without food or sleep, and still no sign of relief. Some began writing letters they would never send. Others cleaned their rifles one more time, as if ritual could keep them steady. Every man on that cliff knew what was coming. The next assault would either finish them or make them legends. June 8th, 1944. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were silent except for the wind. Smoke drifted across the shattered plateau, the sea below calm and deceptive after 2 days of unrelenting violence. The Rangers, those who could still stand, prepared for the end. They had no idea that help was finally on its way. At noon, through the haze of gunfire and exhaustion, movement appeared along the coastal road. Helmets, figures advancing through the fields. For a dreadful moment the Rangers thought it was another German assault, until one man shouted, "They're ours!" Relief rolled across the cliff top like thunder. It was the 5th Ranger Battalion, joined by elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion, pushing west from Omaha Beach. The siege was over. When the reinforcements reached the point, they found a scene that defied imagination. Craters the size of houses, bunkers torn open like broken teeth, dead men, American and German, lying side by side among the rubble. The survivors looked ghost-like, covered in blood, soot and salt, their uniforms ripped, their eyes hollow. When they were counted, only 90 of the original 225 Rangers could still fight. But the mission had succeeded beyond all expectation. The 6 guns that could have slaughtered thousands on the beaches were gone, their barrels melted, their optics shattered. The coastal highway had been cut, German reinforcements had been delayed, and the invasion had survived its most vulnerable hours. What they had achieved on that narrow cliff was more than tactical. It was proof of concept. That courage, training, and initiative could accomplish what strategy alone declared impossible. The aftermath was not triumph, but exhaustion. Rudder himself was barely conscious, wounded twice, refusing evacuation until every one of his men was accounted for. When General Omar Bradley received the report, Objective secured. Guns destroyed. He simply nodded, his face unreadable. Later he would call it one of the bravest acts of the entire campaign. The battle for Pointe du Hoc was over, but its consequences rippled across history. In the days that followed, the 914th Grenadier Regiment that had attacked the Rangers was wiped out attempting to regroup. The 352nd Infantry Division, once a formidable defender of Normandy, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The breach at Pointe du Hoc had cracked the psychological armour of the Atlantic Wall. German commanders who once spoke of invincibility began to speak of survival. For the Americans, it became a symbol of what could be achieved when training met conviction. Eisenhower later wrote that the Rangers who climbed those cliffs embodied the spirit that carried the Allies to victory. Omar Bradley called it the moment that proved no objective is beyond reach for those who refuse to yield. But the men who'd been there rarely spoke in such grand terms. When First Sergeant Leonard Lamel was asked decades later how he felt about being called a hero, he shook his head. "Any one of us would have done it," he said softly. "We trained for it. We trusted each other. That's what made it work." His modesty echoed through every survivor's testimony. They spoke not of glory, but of teamwork, of discipline, of the quiet moments between attacks when someone passed a canteen to a wounded comrade, or whispered a joke in the dark to keep fear at bay. In those 2 days, they had lived an entire lifetime of war. The world would not forget it. The scars of the battle still mark Pointe du Hoc today. Visitors walk through the same craters carved by naval shells, peer into the same bunkers that once sheltered German gunners, and look down the same 100-foot cliffs that the Rangers climbed under fire. The sea crashes below, indifferent, eternal. The silence feels heavier when you know what happened there. 40 years after the assault, on June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan stood at the edge of that cliff before 62 surviving Rangers, his voice carried by the wind that had once carried gunfire. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," he said. "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the heroes who helped free a continent behind him. The channel shimmered under sunlight, the same sea that had carried those men to destiny." The audience wept openly. Even the soldiers, hardened by memory, bowed their heads. Time had turned the battle into legend, but for those who had been there, it was not legend. It was the memory of screams, of ropes cutting into palms, of friends who never came home. Colonel James Earl Rudder returned to Texas after the war, serving his country in peace as he had in war. He became president of Texas A&M University, a symbol of leadership forged in those days on the cliff. He never spoke often of Pointe du Hoc, but when asked what he remembered most, he answered simply, "The men who didn't make it." His widow Margaret would later tell a reunion of Rangers that he never considered himself a hero, only a man who had the privilege to lead heroes. The cost of that mission remained staggering, over 60% casualties in 48 hours. Many of the survivors went on to fight in France and Germany, through the hedgerows, the Siegfried Line, and the frozen hell of the Hürtgen Forest. Few escaped unscathed, yet every Ranger who followed carried the legacy of Pointe du Hoc within them. The US Army later built that legacy into its creed, "Rangers lead the way." It was more than a motto. It was a promise written in blood and stone on that French cliff. The assault had proven that specialized forces, properly trained and led, could achieve results disproportionate to their size. Modern special operations doctrine, from Rangers to Delta to SEALs, draws its lineage from that morning in June 1944. And for the Germans, Pointe du Hoc became a grim lesson in the limits of fortification. No wall, no bunker, no cliff could withstand an enemy willing to climb straight into hell. In 1979, the French government transferred the site to the American Battle Monuments Commission. Today, more than 400,000 people visit each year. The memorial, a granite pylon rising above the bunker, bears an inscription in English and French. It tells the story simply, that here, on June 6, 1944, men of the United States 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled the cliffs and destroyed the guns that threatened the invasion. Nothing more is needed. The silence of the wind and the weight of the stone tell the rest. The lesson of Pointe du Hoc is not merely about war. It is about the human capacity to face the unthinkable, to look at an impossible wall and climb anyway. It is about courage born not of confidence, but of duty. When they set out across the channel that morning, every Ranger knew the odds. Many wrote letters to loved ones before boarding the landing craft, sealing them in waterproof bags that would never be opened. They climbed not because they expected to survive, but because they were told it mattered, and because they believed that was enough. That belief carried them up those cliffs and through the days that followed. It carried the invasion across France and the Allies to victory. It carries their memory still. The cliffs remain, scarred but unbroken, like the men who once conquered them. And in that eternal wind over Normandy, you can almost hear their voices, calm, steady, and unafraid. Rangers lead the way,